Enamana, enareo, enakaranga maha, tena koto katoa. Te mana whenua o tene wahi, te iwi o rangitane, tena koto o tira, ena iwi whanui, tena koto katoa. Kia ora koto katoa, assalamu alaikum, namaskar. I am Mohan Tara with CARE Massey University, and it is my humble honor to welcome you to this session, The Dark Psychology of Dehumanization and Islamophobia. I whakapapa to Bengal, one of the earliest spaces of colonization by the British East India Company and of anti-colonial, anti-racist struggles against it. Before we begin the session, I invite you to consider the house rules for dialogue. Let's commit to creating an invitational space, one that respects each other and seeks to build our mutual commitments to solidarity in anti-racist struggles. I invite you to ask questions using the Q&A functions on Zoom. 3 years since the Islamophobic violence of the Christchurch terrorist attacks, as we grapple in Aotearoa with the hate manifest in the attacks, as we struggle to find the most meaningful ways to challenge the infrastructures of Islamophobia fueled by white supremacists, Hindutva supremacists, and right-wing Zionist hate groups globally and here in Aotearoa, often working alongside each other. And as we negotiate the Islamophobia that has been seeded into the structures of the security, police, military state in the backdrop of the global war on terror, it is vital to explore the underlying psychological processes of dehumanization that shape and mobilize Islamophobia. In this panel, we will explore dehumanization, what it is, and how it forms the infrastructure of Islamophobia, the violent effects of dehumanization and Islamophobia, the limits of current political leadership and political formations in addressing dehumanization and Islamophobia, and finally, the potential solutions that are going to be urgently needed to resist Islamophobia. We have with us today two amazing activists working day and night, working by placing their bodies on the line, often facing these forces of hate to challenge the structures of disinformation that are circulated by those political and economic forces that profit from Islamophobia. Sister Anjum Rahman was a founding member of the New Zealand Islamic Women's Council, a spokesperson for the Muslim community following the Christchurch mosque shootings, and is the founder of the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective to combat discrimination. We also have with us Brother Ikhlaq Kashkari, who is the president of the New Zealand Muslim Association. Welcome, Anjum and Ikhlaq. We will begin with the first question, which is what is dehumanization and how it is related to Islamophobia? And I invite you, Anjum, to address this first, and then we will come to you, Ikhlaq.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Tēnā koutou katoa. He uri tēnei no inia, ko Qamar Shamim Rawa, ko Anisul Rahman oku kaumatua, ko Kirikiri Roa toku whatumanoa, ko Waikato te awa e mahia nei aku maharahara, ke Kirikiri Roa aho e noho ana inaine, ko Anjum Rahman toku ingoa. Thank you, Professor Mohan, thank you for inviting me to address this topic. I'd like to just quickly begin by acknowledging Mana Whenua for where I'm at, which is Kirikiri Roa Hamilton, which is Ngāti Mahanga, Ngāti Wairiri, and Ngāti Hawa, and also acknowledge the Kingitanga. So dehumanization, I'd like to begin with the concept of dangerous speech. And if people are interested in that, I'll just quickly post a link into the chat. But dangerous speech, the hallmarks of this, which you'll find on the website, is dehumanizing language, creating a fear of a mortal threat from a disfavored or minority group, which makes violence seem not just acceptable, but necessary. And it also involves portraying the target group as violating the purity of the in-group, making violence a necessary method of preserving one's identity. Those are three aspects. There's a lot more on the website, but when we focus in on the dehumanizing language, I took a piece from this article that has been put out in Australia. And I'll just again post the link in the chat so that you can access it. Just an excerpt from this article. It says Facebook and by relation Instagram, Twitter, YouTube and LinkedIn recognize dehumanization as a particularly dangerous form of hatred as it removes moral objections one may have to enact violence, even mass violence, and against women and children and civilians more broadly within a target group. Explicit dehumanization refers to classically dehumanizing terms such as comparing a human group to animals, bacteria, filth, disease, weeds, subhuman beings, inanimate or non-living objects or supernatural creatures. So I thought I would give you some really quick examples of what that looks like in practice. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen here. Please bear with me. And so these are all taken from New Zealand Facebook pages. And so this is basically when coronavirus first came into India, Muslims and the Tablighi Jamaat were targeted as spreaders of the virus. And here China is seen as producing the virus, and then the Muslim community in India, and particularly Tablighi Jamaat, were blamed for spreading the virus. So you can see that dehumanization in the image, let alone the accuracy of whether this is what actually happened. Here's another one, you know, it is a metaphor, but again, it's dehumanizing in terms of referencing women to being a chicken and converting to KFC. This one, you'll notice the language that I just had described in the article, which is the jihadi cockroaches, and they're pinpointing people gathering for prayer under coronavirus restrictions, without saying whether, you know, these are all within a bubble or family groups or so on. But this is the language that is being used to dehumanize, and this is another example where, you know, again, the person is just like, you know, they're acting innocent. Oh, I don't know if it's true or not, but putting some really disgusting material on there, which easily, one, they could go and find out, and secondly, is just quite abusive. So I think a final point that I'd make on this is that it's not just the content itself. Like, so if each of those was just an individual post in the world, you'd look at it and think idiot or whatever it is you want to think, and carry on. But it's the sheer volume of this kind of content, and it is at such scale, and it has a really significant impact, and really it's both the scale and the content that has the impact. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Kia ora katoa. I guess one of the challenges, as Anjum has highlighted, is all of this dehumanization, where they take the person away from it and even sort of talk about it being innocence. But then you think about it as a wider perspective of it. You get groups or groups of people or even communities and nations who, for their interests, or to push forward their sort of agendas, they will dehumanize it. They will talk about, if I go back to Iraq war, for example, it talked about weapons of mass destruction. We had to go in to do what we had to do. If you look at what happens in Palestine, Hamas is a terrorist organization, hence we need to actually flatten the Gaza. If you go to Kashmir, same thing, to terrorism and terrorists. We just need to take them out. So it's okay to take this group out, and this is happening around the world. And people forget that there is actually a person or a group of people who are there, who are vulnerable, who actually don't have, unfortunately, a lot of power that they can exert, but they become victims of it. And then what happens, as I can relate back to what happened prior to March 15th in New Zealand, things get normalized. They get really, really normalized. I used to be in meetings where people will call Islamic terrorism. Even our Prime Minister would talk about, and people say, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. So that's actually dehumanizes that. And even if you look at what's happening right here in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the moment, there's a lot of controversy that's gone around the Kashmir files, and what is reality is completely lost in dehumanization of the Muslim community, talking about what is fabricated lies are being supported, particularly by those groups who have interest in it. So it's really just taking the humanity out of the human being and portraying things in the way they want to portray in order to oppress or put their views above the views of the oppressors. So I'll just leave it there for the timing, and back to Mohan.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Anjum and Ikhlaq, for that depiction of what dehumanization looks like. That's really powerful. And I think your examples, particularly in terms of the metaphors and the language and the narratives that are crafted, are really powerful. Anjum, I want to go back to the examples that you shared. Now, one of the things that happens with many of those narratives is that those get shared by community leaders, if you will, or by political leaders or people that are attached to mainstream political parties. Could you speak a little bit to that in terms of what really are the effects when this kind of dehumanizing content gets mainstreamed through mainstream political parties in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yeah, thank you. One of the points I'll quickly make is that a lot of this content, and even though it's on New Zealand websites, so all of those were New Zealand-based Facebook groups and people living in New Zealand that were commenting, but a lot of the language is not in English. And so some of the worst stuff I couldn't put in front of you because it wasn't in English. So that's another factor that it goes under the radar, and we know that some of these 10 companies, they have very little capacity to deal with material that isn't in English. And we've heard that 9% of Facebook content, for example, is in English, 9%. And they're just not dealing very well at all with the other 81%. So the effects of dehumanization and Islamophobia, first of all, it's the mental and emotional health. When you're consistently and constantly getting messages that are telling you you're evil, you're bad, they're, using language like that, abusive language, it really has an impact on your mental health and well-being at an individual level. And especially, as I said, because it's the sheer volume of the content, it's the nature of the content, and with the effects on the mental health, and then also impacts on your ability to work, your ability to interact with society. In a global context, the impact of this kind of stuff is physical safety. So from the loss of life to being punched while being pregnant, with drive-by acid thrown in faces, scarves being torn off and women filmed while that's happening, verbal abuse. All of these are real life things that have happened to Muslim women. And it's interesting that as Muslim women, we sit here in the space where we're told that we get treated as second-class citizens by Muslim men in Muslim countries or even here. And then, so not only are we portrayed as victims, but then we're also victimized as if I don't know what. I don't see the disconnect. So you think they're treating us as second-class citizens, but then you perpetrate violence against us because of that. It's pretty awful. Another impact is the silencing, the doxing, the death threats, the rape threats, all of these things that journalists and other academics and so on that are facing, particularly Muslim women journalists, Muslim women academics, the apps, that are putting Muslim women for sale and threatening to rape and impregnate them, all of these kinds of things. You find that some people just drop off. They drop offline, they delete their accounts, they cannot handle the volume of vitriol, which was of course the intent of the people that are making these kinds of posts, is they want to silence us, which means where is our freedom of speech? They're directly attacking our freedom of speech. So if you actually believe in free speech, you would want to protect our free speech from these kinds of things. You get legislative restrictions on our ability to practice faith. So France, for example, where it's illegal for girls to wear a hijab in school, it's illegal to wear a burqa at the beach or in any public place. Belgium, of course, India now, and the issues that we're seeing in Karnataka, and even the legal systems that are not there to protect us and to protect our faith. And in other circumstances, the rest of society would speak up about this. They would be allies. They would not allow this to happen. But because we are so dehumanized, that people just get into the space of not caring. Our ability to participate in society, like we're being shut out of spaces, and you get into this defense mode of sticking into your own community. You're afraid to go out of the house alone. We have young women after the March 19 attacks saying when they go in a bus, they sit next to the door so they have a quick escape because they don't know what will happen. Ability to access services, including health, education, employment, housing. I could give you so many stories, but I know we have limited time of how these are denied in certain ways. You can't get a rental house, or your CV is just thrown in the bin, you're not considered, or you're dissuaded in school from taking certain subjects. All so many stories. If you go to our website, at Inclusive Aotearoa, we have a whole range of stories, not just from the Muslim community, about these issues. And it impacts political participation as well as leadership and decision making when those opportunities are denied to us because we're seen as being less than or being overlooked and set aside. And you know, when we look at, again, effects of racism of this kind overseas, you see measures put in place to prevent voting, for example, for in the US, way fewer voting booths in black areas, gerrymandering, restrictive voter ID laws, not being given leave because they don't have it on a weekend day. And if you worked on the weekend, well, you need leave to go out to vote, which if you're a black person takes hours and hours and hours. And not getting that leave, given wrong information and misinformation that your local voting site is closed, so don't go there. All of these kind of tactics that are being used, and again, because people are dehumanized, it's, you know, the pushback just isn't there.
Namihi, Anjum, perhaps Ikhlaq, you could build on that a little bit, but also I wanted to offer a little bit of context with what you brought up with regard to the Kashmir Files, which is a film produced in India on the movement of Kashmiri Pandits out of Kashmir, and which has sort of triggered multiple incidences of hate speech in India in theaters as the film has been platformed, including calls for killing Muslims, calls for Hindus to rape Muslim women. So that is the context within which the Muslim community has expressed its concern. So the thing I wanted to bring up is, Anjum, as you point out, how freedom of expression is used as a narrative to then discount the concerns. We are seeing this right now with regard to the Kashmir files, as the censor is going through a review. We have mainstream New Zealand politicians, David Seymour, Melissa Lee, Winston Peters, talking about how this violates or threatens freedom of expression. So could you speak to that in terms of how the narrative of freedom of expression is often used to circulate and enable dehumanizing context and the effects of that?
Thanks, Mohan. I just want to actually go back to, before I answer that question, I'd like to talk about impact of what Anjum was talking about in terms of on our youth as well. So one of the biggest challenges we have had with the youth in New Zealand, in Aotearoa New Zealand, is because they're called terrorists, or the language that's used for them to dehumanize them, a lot of them actually at school or college or universities, they don't even want to be known to be Muslims because that basically makes them a target, again, a dehumanization of it. And also it depends on what race you are, how they will how you will be classified, and that also applies to this what you call this concept of freedom of speech. If I look at for example, what's happening in Ukraine, and everybody knows it's a terrible, terrible human tragedy what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Ukraine, and innocent people are getting killed. But what actually, when you look at what's happened in Ukraine in terms of, for example, refugees, in terms of giving arms to Ukrainians, and a Ukrainian person blowing a bridge and being a sort of suicide bomber, that was all encouraged as being shown hero. Whereas if that would happen in Palestine or anywhere else, that would be a terrorist and that sort of stuff. So I think there's a huge impact on our youth in terms of from school through to jobs. Anjum talked about people actually really struggling. They actually would change names. So they would send their CV with their Muslim names, they wouldn't get an interview. As soon as they change the name, call us a John or a Smith or whatever, same companies, you actually will call for an interview for these companies. So again, dehumanization there. Now, in terms of coming back to Kashmir Files, again, it's a very, very selective narrative, because if you look at freedom of speech, as you all know, or if you don't, you can probably Google yourself, Kashmir was in blockade of communication for over a year when India annexed it on 15th of August 2019. And they had no telephones there, landlines, they had no mobiles, there was no internet, there was no local newspapers, there was no local TV or anything. So everything was complete blackout, couldn't talk because India was doing its operations. At that stage, freedom of speech didn't exist. And when you talk about, for example, what BJP leaders have been saying off lately, there was a conference of BJP leaders where they talked about Muslims. If a few hundred of us get up and kill a few million Muslims, that will clean up a lot of sort of Muslims from the face of India. So that's actually okay to say, and there's no repercussions of it. But then if you take somebody like a students' union person from Delhi University, I think it was, or something, it was Delhi University, and he was put behind the bars, but just by raising issue of fascism and racism. And then you come back to New Zealand, same thing applies, and we have seen this time and again. We have seen it prior to March 15th, where if things were talked about, as I said earlier, we accepted it. We were a silent majority that actually, when I would be in a meeting, we'll be talking about Islamic terrorism, Islamic terrorists, and all this sort of stuff, language that was used, jihadi brides. We just didn't say anything because we kept quiet, and it normalized it. But when it actually comes to something like, for example, David Seymour's statement, in his statement on Kashmir Files, is that Modi said it's okay. It's a true story. But if you go back and read what the rest of the world said, that doesn't mean anything. But because Modi, and then you need to look back, and Modi did in Gujarat, 2,000 Muslims were killed at that time when he was in power, and he told people, don't touch them. Don't stop Hindu mobs killing people. So that was okay. And then he became prime minister. We've really forgotten that he was banned from entering the US. But because narrative has changed, because India has become more economic power, particularly in New Zealand, it's actually becoming quite strong in politics, and very large number of, I would say, people that are aligned to right wing have established their positions, and they're able to get that narrative that they want. So the lies are being turned into the truth, and truths are turned into lies. Just to give you one more figure, if you talk about genocide of Kashmiri Pandits, you just need to go to United Nations. They have issued a genocide alert on Kashmir. So this sort of rhetoric that's being built is actually to commit genocide of people of Kashmir, the Muslims of Kashmir. And if you look at what happened even 1989, when they talk about 59, we talk about 59, and again, terrible, any innocent life was killed. 59 Hindu Pandits were killed at that time, and around 1,600 Muslims were killed. So that's classified as a genocide, whereas 100,000 Muslims killed in Kashmir is not classified as genocide. So there is your differences in the narrative and how it's portrayed.
Thanks for offering that context, Ikhlaq. I wanted to move on to sort of thinking about solutions, and really, given your activist work and challenging the various forms of dehumanization in various structures, I wanted to ask, what are the kinds of strategies you draw upon to resist dehumanization and Islamophobia?
Look, there's a number of things we do. I mean, as I said, in the past, it was normalized, and we were actually really quiet and didn't talk about it. And I think actually what's personally made me talk more about it is actually March 15th. I just said to myself, I'm not going to be the silent majority. So I will speak up, and I'll speak up more loudly than I've ever done before. And so to me, one thing is, don't be we need to stop being a silent majority. We do need to speak up. If we do see something wrong, then we need to call it. Let's not just ignore it. Second thing is, we need to actually continuously work with the government and the agencies to break that glass ceilings that Anjum was talking about earlier. We need to be able to have people of all sort of what you call as all the ethnicities and cultures and whatever in New Zealand we need to have some representation of them at certain levels. And I'm not advocating for because somebody is a Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh or Christian or Jewish, you should be put in a place. I think it's really important that they have skills and capability to be able to do the job as well. But I think what we have at the moment is glass ceilings, and they need to break. So we are actually pushing in discussions with various government agencies, and we've been having lots of kororo on some of those. How do we ensure where we can have multiple identities and those identities are celebrated? They're not. So I can be a New Zealander, I can be a Muslim, and I can be Kashmiri. I don't have to choose one of them or two of them. I can be all of them. And we should be able to celebrate, and we should be able to leverage off it. We should be able to say, okay, well, as a Muslim, I can connect Muslim world, Muslim culture. As a Kashmiri, I can bring Kashmiri culture, a rich culture. And as a New Zealander, I can do all of these great things in the world. So we should be able to celebrate that. And I think that's something that we have started having a really good kororo with the governments and the agencies. Saying that, a lot of discussions we're having that continuously, and we having repetitive discussions. We are achieving some success, but I think there is a lot work to be done, and the speed at which we're achieving it, we need to pick that speed up and do it faster. So there are some of the challenges there. And funding, for example, from a government perspective, we can say whatever we like, we don't have funding to make it happen. So it's not going to happen. So allowing for that funding and resources to make those positive changes.
Yeah, I'll take over. I've got so much to put into this space. piece in terms of what I've been drawing on in terms of the activist work. So I think particularly back in the early 2000s and with the events happening internationally, it was a time when we realized the importance of media and the narratives of the media, because they were very harsh against the Muslim community. And so I guess that was the time when I started to try and build a media voice by trying to write opinion pieces and be visible in the media. I really have to acknowledge people like Willie Jackson when he had his Eye to Eye program, and then the ability to be on Close Up and so on, that being able to just speak back to some of the very awful rhetoric and political rhetoric was incredibly important. That's also why I got into politics for a bit, and so I tried that for about a decade, not really successfully, but at least I was in spaces and being able to put points of view forward. Also, I've been to so many protests and protest activities, whether, more recent times joining in protests on the CAA, or last month in Auckland outside the consulate around the banning of the hijab. I've been to anti-war marches, the women's marches, child abuse, against the Iraq war back in the day, and so physically raising my voice as much as possible. Submissions to legislation, government inquiries and consultations, both at local and central government, so things like the gun control laws. And I still remember the select committee came to Kirikiriroa, and I asked for a police escort to be able to go and present to that select committee because I felt so unsafe at that time. I've submitted to the Public Sector Legislation Bill, the Films, Videos and Publications Classification Act, which deals with our censorship laws, counter-terrorism legislation, funding of sexual violence services. Again, just using those opportunities to have my voice heard. I use my social media. I used to, when blogs were a much bigger thing, I used to blog regularly and try and get writing and thought out there. I used to contribute to group blogs such as The Standard and the Hand Mirror. And, as part of the team of the Islamic Women's Council, we tried to raise these issues with government from around 2015, 2016. And of course, part of dehumanization, I believe it was that dehumanization that meant that we weren't listened to and we weren't taken seriously. Most recently, I started Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tahono with the support of a group of people. And it's a project that really is about bringing communities together from very different sectors of the community, and not even just looking at ethnic or faith diversity, but all the diversities and all the different ways that, wonderful ways that humans express themselves. And as part of that, and for me, a critical and crucial part of this work is honouring Te Tiriti. And, within this organisation, we've really tried hard to build it as a Te Tiriti-based organisation. We have a Poutikanga co-lead with the Iwi Chairs Forum, and we really work on our training, our tikanga, our understanding of things like Mātiki Mai and constitutional reform, because I think for a lot of these issues, like we face Islamophobia and dehumanization, but other communities also face dehumanization, and the Māori community faces it really strongly. So we have a responsibility for whatever we want for us, we want them for all those communities as well. So it's really important to work across communities around some of these issues.
I mean, it's so beautiful what you talk about in terms of building those registers of solidarity and really beginning in many ways by listening to the voices of Tangata Whenua and anchoring the struggles in Te Tiriti. One of the things that is also really powerful in your articulations is this idea that there is a vision for the future in terms of how that struggle continues. But that is also juxtaposed in the backdrop of this ongoing articulation of not being heard. I've heard you articulate this, Ikhlaq, have you heard you articulate this, Anjum, that the community voices, activist voices keep bringing up the issues, and yet it seems that those voices are not heard. So that's sort of my last wraparound prompt, which is, what are the solutions you potentially see going forward in terms of addressing dehumanization and Islamophobia? Perhaps we can begin with you, Anjum, and then go to you, Ikhlas.
Sure. Thank you for all the lovely comments, by the way. I really appreciate them. So one of the things is that a lot of the solutions do need to be collective, which is why, you know, we take a collective approach to it, because, and that kind of came from my experience, that we were just one organization, like really felt like we were butting our heads against the wall. It was easy to ignore, but when we work as a collective, it's much harder to be ignored. Some of the solutions in a more practical sense. So one of the roles that I have is as the co-chair of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network, and the Christchurch Call is about reducing or removing terrorist and violent extremist content online. And it's really fun in terms of, you know, what Ikhlas said earlier, in trying to define what is a terrorist and what is a violent extremist. And certainly those things, there's no agreed definition, even as we are now. But regardless of that, there are things like that we could look at, such as product liability. So all of these tech platforms, they have no liability around what is appearing on their website. And we know, you know, there's ample research, there's a reasonable amount of research on Facebook, but I know that other platforms are having impacts as well. Facebook's currently being sued about the impact they've had on the genocide of Rohingya. There's research or information out there about the impact they're having in Tigray, in India, the TechFog app. There was just an series of articles last week. One of the takeaways from that article was that the BJP was effectively being charged much less for the same reach than Congress or other parties because of the way that the algorithms and the engagement works. So we need to start holding these platforms liable for the design of their product that is causing this kind of harm. Secondly, I think because a lot of these platforms using algorithms, so whether it's, you know, whether you hit your Facebook likes or whatever, liking a post, and it'll make, the more likes you have and the more shares will make it more viral. Interestingly, with Facebook, they have weighted the angry button, given it 5 times the weight of a like button. So if your post generates more outrage and more anger and upset, then it will be more viral because of the way they've designed their algorithm. And there are many instances of, you know, the way the Google search engines work, and so on. So I've written a paper, it's on the Internet New Zealand website, and I should have had the link handy, but I will post it, it's on my social media on Twitter, around algorithmic audits and how we might stand up an infrastructure to go and audit these companies to see what impact their algorithms had. We need the regulation to do that. We need more transparency. But I want to tautoko what Ikhlas said about investment in communities, resourcing communities. This is why this project is a strongly community-based project, because for me, the answer to these things lie in the power of community. And so we're about how can we bring communities together, create the forums, create the opportunities, facilitate the conversations, because if we don't devolve power into these communities, then we can't solve the problems. And last thing, very quickly, I'll say, if you really want to solve the problems, let's get the basics: poverty, housing, education, health. Like, absolutely, if you're gonna have people sleeping in cars and not having food and all of the stuff, you're never solving these issues. You cannot say you can solve dehumanization, racism, and all of those things without solving the basics for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjum. That was wonderful. If I could just add a little bit to it from where I stand, I think I can see, first and foremost, we need to recognize dehumanization is a crime, because unless we acknowledge and accept it, we can't move forward. So once we've acknowledged it, then we can look at, in terms of, when we can't ignore what, for example, Anjum just said, people sleeping in the street, not having the food, because that then is visible to you. And one of the things is standards. If you want to dehumanize things, you need to have same human rights standards right across. So we can't use one scale of human rights for one group and another one for anybody else. So we have to actually have one set of rules which are applicable to the entire community. And one of the challenges that we have is being able to, when there's dehumanization, the big challenge that happens is you live in a bubble. You isolate yourself from the community. So I think to break that bubble, we need to actually embrace, and we need to encourage people to come out. We need people to be able to feel safe, not only physically, but also mentally and emotionally, to be able to integrate and be able to have a communication. So I think that's a really, really important component of that. Inclusivity, more inclusivity, whether it's cultural, religious, and designing the solutions and services that are actually provided to our communities. They take those into account, and it recognizes that that there may be some different ways the service is delivered. I'll give you a very quick example, which may sound really odd. I'm aware of somebody who actually helped one of his employees as a Muslim person. She was going to get a loan from a loan shark, 20% to buy a car. So this person actually lent her the money, said, you go and you can pay part of your from your salary. But justice, when there was a court case, Justice Department did not recognize as a kindness. They did not accept that person's witness because they felt that that person actually, because they had got a favor from this person, hence they're saying the wrong. They're actually trying to protect this person. So that's something from culturally, people don't sometimes understand why somebody will do that, because in Islam, accepting of or paying of interest is not seen as a good thing. So really trying to understand there was differences, cultural differences are there that may actually have those solutions that we have that tailor for some of them as well. And as I mentioned earlier, really important to have that multiple sort of ability where you can have multiple identities. And one of the big things, media coverage and how media portrays things. And because I guess really media is commercial entity, they sell sensationalism sells, hence they will portray. But if we can actually have that positive interaction with media, then that definitely will be one of the ways forward as well. And then grassroots connections. Look, we can only change things when we're connected to that. We can talk at leadership level, whatever we like, but if the grassroots is disconnected, then we are disconnected. So really finding those integration points, finding the methods, like, for example, one of the things we've been talking about in Auckland is, why can't we have local sort of community groups that can actually find employment for the locals, within the locals? So you have local businessmen, local communities, so they can find some local solutions for the local problems. So really connecting community to grassroots level would be really another wonderful thing to sort of overcome that dehumanization.
Yora, thank you, Anjum and Nicola. A lot of powerful ideas there in terms of solutions that go all the way from the local to the meso level structures to macro level structures. Let's go to the questions, and we have some amazing questions. I'm going to begin with the first question related to social media, because indeed, as you point out, Anjum, social media is one of the fundamental sites that gets weaponized in circulating the disinformation. So the question is, do you think that the social media are exacerbating the hate, or that the hate already exists and is being made visible online and then spreading?
So I'm not, it's not an either or question, it's a both and. Okay, so the hate does already exist. but without these algorithms and the way that it spreads and the way that they're designed to make outrageous content viral, it means that more people see it than would otherwise have seen it. So it's that ability to spread, and the way that human beings are wired. I mean, everyone will be like, I'm a real individual, I have my own views or whatever, but the fact is we are influenced by others, right? That's why people do it. And when you see a whole lot of people agree with that thing and say the same thing, then you think, oh, maybe there's something to it. That's a natural instinct. And when you don't realize that these many people that you see that are saying this thing are actually computerized bots, automated responses, or paid actors, then your perception that actually a lot of people agree with this thing, so it must be right, is being skewed. So it makes that dehumanization, one, more visible, more acceptable. We've talked about becoming normalized. Yeah.
Ikla, go ahead.
Mona, I was just going to say is, if you look at the recent survey from Australia that's just been released this week, they talk about hate on social media has grown by 18%. Sorry, 18, not 18%, I beg your pardon, 18 times more since March 15th, 2019. So it is exploding. And as Anjum said, the challenge we have is these bots and the way the systems are, the search engines are designed. So if you search for something, it will think that you would actually wanted more. So it will actually automatically recommend you some of those sites that are even, more and more that aligns with what you were looking for earlier. So if you look at the investment that some of these people are making or countries are making that promote that dehumanization or Islamophobia is enormous in there. And you can see, for example, even recently in New Zealand, actually, let me go back to prior to March 19th. And I could see it that when Mark Jihadi, because March 15th happened just prior to Mark Jihadi was going to come from Syria to New Zealand. So there was a whole lot of discussions taking place in New Zealand, whether it was what you call as talkback radios, internet news. They were all talking, hey, we'll have Islamic Jihadi coming to New Zealand, blah, blah, or danger of it. And I saw a massive spike in the hate mail that I was getting and the phone calls I was getting. And that was basically as a result of the action that was taking place somewhere else, and all of a sudden that spiked in New Zealand. If you talk about Jihadi Bride, when our previous Prime Minister made a comment about Jihadi brides going to from New Zealand to Syria to marry these sort of IS people, and then there was a massive spike in New Zealand against hate. So really, all of that, and that's all triggered by online system, and it's getting every day faster and faster, and more contents, and more people connected into it, and then bots, which play a huge role. So I actually think a huge impact of that.
Something else also, Ikla, your example points out, is that the online system is intertwined with local politics and local politicians. There are politicians that clearly also profit from that circulation of hate. And
if they don't get the message they're getting, some of those countries are authoritarian, they would stop them and say, through the bigger countries and powerful countries, IT companies shall do what they've been told to do.
Yeah. This, and particularly the IT, the digital infrastructures and hate, leads to another corresponding question, which is, and I will club two questions together, which is, I understand that this is a global conversation, but in terms of Aotearoa, do you think our government is doing enough? What more do you think it can do? And related question then is, what are the platforms that are available for Muslims in order to articulate their voices and to be consulted? Is there enough consultation taking place right now?
I'll let you go first.
Well, look, there's a lot of conversations that are taking place, and I must admit, every day I'm probably involved. Every week I'm probably involved in at least 3 or 4 sort of meetings or HUIs with the government or the agencies that take place. That is in addition to all other who's that you have in terms of non-strategic nature. Yes, there are a lot of discussions taking place, and there have been a lot of discussions that have taken place in the past. As I said earlier, though, is the speed, the pace at which the outcomes are happening, or those corridors, those discussions are resulting in changes. Let's talk about hate speech laws. It was 3 years ago. Then at that point in time, we decided we have hate speech laws will be written in New Zealand. We are actually 3 years. It hasn't happened. We are 3 years late. Why is it taking us 3 years to do them? I mean, it's just an example. So in terms of, yes, discussions are taking place, and I must admit this is the most we've ever done by any government, and I take hats off for Prime Minister who has actually initiated these discussions. Whereas previously they weren't happening. But even when we were talking, nobody was listening to us. We were talking and talking and talking, but nobody was listening at that time. At least somebody is at least having that discussion, whether they're hearing or listening or acting on that, maybe a secondary issue. There has to be, in terms of urgency in delivering the outcomes. Otherwise, you get frustrated that I'm having too many meetings and no outcomes. And then there has to be funding to make sure, in terms of those initiatives are implemented. I think they're the challenges. Otherwise, yes, squirrel is happening.
Yeah. So my answer is like this: there is stuff happening. So the police, for example, have been working for a couple of years almost now, at least 18 months, on the recording of hate crimes piece of work. And they're looking at various other aspects around training and so on. There's MSD is leading the social cohesion work. Ministry of Justice is leading the National Action Plan Against Racism work. So and in the various departments, there is stuff that is happening, but what we're not seeing yet, like it's all still frameworks and plans and talking to people. That they've taken seriously Royal Commission recommendation to involve communities. They're not yet at co-design, but they're at the involved stage of talking to communities. And yeah, I guess as a person in the community, it's frustrating that we need action now and having to wait through the processes. My second concern is that, while the government has committed to implementing all the Royal Commission recommendations, opposition parties haven't. And so the social cohesion framework, I don't know, hopefully it will come out sometime this year. The action plan against racism, likely not to come out until next year. And then we have a change of government, and then what? Does all this work get lost? Are they going to commit a budget to it? Is this government going to commit a budget to it? And what is the budget? And so for all of you lovely people who are listening, we need to push. We need to push hard that no matter what government there is, I cannot believe there would be a political party that is saying we don't want people to be safe. We're happy for a terrorist attack like those in Christchurch to happen again. Like, I know that none of them feel that way. Therefore, they should be committing to the Royal Commission recommendations and committing to these work programs that have had a lot of investment but need a whole lot more investment. And thirdly, when that investment happens, it can't just sit in government. It can't just sit in the public service. That investment has to come out into communities. It's critical. And that is, for me, that's one of the blocks, for example, with the family and sexual violence work. The money has been committed, but the organisations are not seeing that money on the ground. The ones that are struggling to provide services on family and sexual violence are not, we need to make sure that the people that are doing the work actually get the resourcing.
Yora, thank you so much, Ikhlaq and Anjum, for those powerful responses. Unfortunately, we are at 4:56 and we are going to move toward wrapping up. I just want to thank you both for your inspiring work and your activism and your ongoing struggle to transform these spaces of hate, and also your work in community, in the grassroots, in building infrastructures for voices to be heard. I want to thank the partners, particularly Community Research, for the webinar support, and the many volunteers who have supported with putting up this event. The recording will be made available via YouTube and the website, depending upon the IP agreement terms each speaker has signed. Please remember to visit the Facebook page, DCALL 2020, and please also join the Pecha Kucha Marathon for Racial Justice later in the week. As we wrap up, I want to once again acknowledge you, Anjum. I want to acknowledge you, Ikhlaq, and the struggles of our many Muslim brothers and sisters against the infrastructures of disinformation and hate. I want to wrap up inviting us all to witness. Perhaps witnessing is an entry point to challenging hate. A lot of research suggests that bystander interventions are really powerful in addressing racist infrastructures. I will wrap up with a quote from the poem Hum Dekhenge by the poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, that has formed a basis for struggles against Islamophobia in my part of the world, in India. The poet has become so powerful that it is now being incorporated by right-wing hate groups and being attacked in order to turn it on its head. So this poem translates into "We shall see," inviting us to witness. And this translation I'm going to share with you is by Mustansir Dalvi. Inevitably, we shall also see the day that was promised to us, decreed on the tablet of eternity, when dark peaks of torment and tyranny will be blown away like cotton fluff, when the earth's beating heart will pulsate beneath our broken feet, when crackling, crashing lightning will smite the heads of our tormentors, when from the seat of the Almighty every pedestal will lie displaced. Then the dispossessed we who kept the faith will be installed to our inalienable agency. Every crown will be flung, each throne brought down. So witnessing is an invitation for us to build spaces that are based upon connection, that are based upon solidarity, and that are committed to the voices of those who have been systematically targeted by the forces of hate, colonialism, racism, and capitalist oppression. Thank you once again for joining.